Warning, ketamine can be addictive and can cause bladder and kidney damage if used chronically. Do not use dissociatives or psychedelics if you are mentally unstable. This information is for educational purposes only and not psychotherapeutic advice. Lessons from ketamine. This is an episode about what I learned from trying ketamine for myself, and I want to compare and contrast it as a dissociative that it is with psychedelics, which I've done a lot of in the past. And so it's interesting to see the differences between those two and the difference in states of consciousness and kinds of awakening that a dissociative can produce versus the classical psychedelics like mushrooms, LSD, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, and all that other stuff that I've talked about in the past. So this is interesting. I've tried a lot of different psychedelic substances that I haven't even issued trip reports on or talked about publicly because honestly, many of them are just more of the same sort of stuff, different flavors or variations on the same kind of stuff that you get with mushrooms, LSD, and DMT. But ketamine is something a little bit different, which is why I felt it was worthwhile to put out this episode. So I plugged about 30 milligrams of ketamine R isomer, and it plugs great, comes on in about 10 minutes. The duration lasts for about an hour and a half. Then after that hour and a half, there's lingering side effects for another hour, let's say, or so. But you're really tripping for just about an hour and a half at most. So it's pretty short as far as psychedelic trips go. It's about the same length of a 5-MeO malt trip, actually, which I've talked about in the past. Go see my episode about 5-MeO malt. So I'm going to be sharing the sort of trip that I went through and the effects, the most poignant aspects of the trip and what unique and interesting effects it had that were different from traditional psychedelics. So right away, the most significant difference is the way that it distorts the visual field. The visual field gets very wonky in an uncomfortable sort of way. Your vision gets a little bit blurry. You get a little bit of a double vision going on, sort of a double vision effect. It's not like you're seeing double of your visual field. It's not that double, but just there's like a little doubling that you see. And there's this thing that's referred to as like visual slippage, which means that as you're looking around the room, it just feels kind of weird and alien, almost as though there's something wrong with your visual field. It's distorting your visual field, not in the classic psychedelic way where your visual field is kind of dancing and morphing around and interesting colors are coming forth, the neon psychedelic classic colors. You don't really get any of that, at least I don't, on a low dose of ketamine. And my dose, I would say it wasn't low, it was kind of like a medium dose. And remember, people have different sensitivities. I'm very sensitive to all psychedelics, so I would assume that I'm also more sensitive to ketamine than most people. But anyways, there's no change in colors per se, but the visual field feels off. It feels a bit alien, weird, and uncomfortable. And it makes it actually a little bit difficult to function. I imagine that if I doubled my dose, the visual field would get very wonky, and it would be quite challenging to even look around the room and to see things and to function in a normal way. And then if the dose was significantly higher, reading from other people's trip reports of very high doses of ketamine, which I haven't personally done, but there's a lot of consensus on this, is that basically even your visual field will get so twisted and distorted that you won't really be able to use it. You won't even be able to read, or at really high doses, you won't even really be able to turn the lights on and off. So there's that, which is a little bit disconcerting. That's one of the reasons I'm a little cautious about going high on the dose with ketamine, but people have definitely done it. You just have to be careful because you will be out of normal function for about an hour and a half. Speaking of which, it's difficult to walk. Even on the sort of moderate dose that I did, it was difficult to walk. You walk like you're intoxicated. You can't walk quite straight. It's difficult to balance. And so that also gave me concern because at that dose, it was manageable. It wasn't really dangerous. But if you double, triple the dose or more, you're going to completely lose your ability to walk. And I could definitely see people trying to walk on this substance at high doses, fumbling, stumbling around, tripping, falling, hitting their head on a coffee table, something like that. So it can definitely get dangerous. If you're going to be doing higher doses of ketamine, anything beyond a moderate dose, you basically have to lock yourself in a room, ideally with no windows and no doors. So, I mean, you're just going to have a door, but ideally with no windows so you don't jump out accidentally, or have a trip sitter with you just to watch you so that you don't hurt yourself. And you have to force yourself to just like lie in bed and don't go running around and having fun. You know, this ketamine, it's not really like a fun substance that you get to have a bunch of fun on the way you can on low doses of psychedelics, where you can go outside and you can frolic around and you can kind of enjoy the scenery. You don't really get that from ketamine. Ketamine has a obviously very dissociating and anesthetic quality to it because it is an anesthetic. It's basically an animal tranquilizer. They use it in veterinary services on dogs, cats, horses to anesthetize them. But that's at a very high dose. You don't take that much when you're doing it in the way that, you know, we're doing it to trip. And it's dissociating. So what does that mean? I mean, it's a dissociative. That's a class of chemical or drug. But what does it really mean, this word dissociation? So I have a few definitions that I looked up for you here. The first one is from WebMD.com, and it says, quote, "Dissociation is a break in how your mind handles information. You may feel disconnected from your thoughts, feelings, memories, and surroundings. It can affect your sense of identity and your perception of time," end quote. That's very, very true. You do become disconnected from your thoughts, feelings, memories, and maybe to a lesser extent, surroundings at the dose that I did, but I'm sure at a higher dose you would disconnect from your surroundings as well. And then another quote I have for you is from Wikipedia on this topic, which says, quote, "Dissociation is any of a wide variety of experiences ranging from a mild emotional detachment from the immediate surroundings to a more severe disconnection from physical and emotional experiences. The major characteristic of all dissociative phenomena involves a detachment from reality rather than a loss of reality, as in psychosis," end quote. So that's sort of your standard textbook definition of dissociation. But really, you don't quite understand what that word means until you do some ketamine and you start to feel that effect come on. And that's what's really so interesting about it, and what makes it different from many of the other psychedelics is that, of course, the other psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, they will screw with your thought process, and they can get you a sense of no self. They can get you to feel like, you know, you're disconnected from your traditional human identity. Of course, they do all that, and they can put you in deep meditative-like states. But ketamine is still quite unique, and it's worth talking about that. And it has some interesting implications for the work that we're doing here with Actualized.org, with spirituality, and with metaphysics and epistemology. So what's really interesting about ketamine is that it shuts off symbolic reasoning and thinking. And it's difficult to explain to someone the significance of that. Basically, it nukes your conceptual mind very significantly, even at a moderate dose. And if the dose was doubled, I would imagine that it would wipe that out entirely. It becomes quite difficult to think. It becomes difficult to reason. It becomes difficult to do analysis or any kind of symbolic logic, which is mostly what you're doing with your mind most of the time. And I was doing some research in preparation for this talk, looking at some scientific studies of, you know, what does ketamine actually do sort of neurologically, chemically in the brain? How does it actually function? And what kind of effect does it have on, you know, brain waves and that kind of thing? And there was a great research study that they did recently on sheep, where they gave ketamine to sheep. And what they realized that when you give a high enough dose of ketamine to a sheep, what happens is, and then they attach electrodes, you know, they basically do an EEG scan with electrodes of the sheep's brain. And what they notice is that it completely shuts off the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is that part of your brain, you know, it's the It's the frontal lobes, so to speak. It's the most evolved, highest level part of the brain. In humans especially, it's more evolved than in other animals. This is what distinguishes humans from other animals. This is what gives us our humanness, you might say, our capacity to reason, to logic, to analyze, to conceptualize, and all of language. So it deactivates that whole thing. And it's one thing just to say that to you, but it's another thing to actually live through what, how that's happening. Now you might say here, well, Leo, isn't that sort of like what the point of meditation is to shut off the thinking mind and just to sit there like an animal, like a cat on a windowsill and just experience life. And of course, that is a lot of what meditation aims to do. So very interestingly, what I found with ketamine is that it aligns very well, the kind of state of consciousness that it put me in aligns very well with the classic Buddhist Advaita Vedanta sorts of meditative states and experiences and even awakenings that I hear a lot from Buddhists and people who follow that sort of Eastern path. A lot less mystical, a lot less visionary, I would say, and more just like it nukes the cerebral cortex. You lose even the desire to think or to analyze anything. And it gives your mind a deep sense of relief. It almost turns you into an animal, I would say. If you want to know what it, kind of like you want to imagine, what is it like to be an animal? They can't really logic. They can't do mathematics. They don't do advanced reasoning. They probably don't think very far ahead into the future or about their past. They're sort of just very like living in the moment and not doing a lot of symbolic thinking. And that's exactly what ketamine gets you a taste of. What's interesting though is how it actually feels and what what insights you take away from this. Because even though in this work we talk a lot about how your mind is conceptualizing all the time and that really what you're living in is you're not living in reality, you're living in a sort of augmented reality where your conceptual mind is projecting and interpreting and doing like a lot of additional layers, adding a lot of additional layers on top of just the raw stuff that's there in reality, we might say. Even though we all kind of logically know this, we understand this, but you don't appreciate how much of your life is conceptual until you take something like ketamine and it just wipes out the whole conceptual mind. I'll talk more about that in a second, but before I get there, because I just kind of want to go in order of how this occurred for me during my experience, is that the first thing that I notice as all this is coming on, beyond my visual field getting wonky and my inability to walk and all that, I'm just sitting there. The first thing that I notice is just how deeply relaxed and comfortable I start to feel. It puts me into an instant, effortless meditative state where my mind is completely blank. But you would think that, but if I'm like in this dissociated sort of like mindless state, then it might feel bad. Actually, no, it feels amazing, because for the first time in your life, perhaps, especially if you've never meditated or if you've never become a very efficient meditator, because it would take you years to be able to reach a state like this through meditation. You get to a point you get to a point in this experience where you're completely free of your thinking mind, and it's such an enormous relief. It's like a giant weight has been lifted off your shoulders that you didn't even feel was there. In the same way that when you're walking around on the surface of the earth, it's pretty effortless just to walk around, but you don't actually feel how much work your body is doing to counteract the gravity on Earth. But then when you shoot into outer space and you're floating around in a vacuum, then all of a sudden you see what it's really like when there's no gravity and how effortless that experience is. And then you come back down to Earth and you feel, oh my God, it's so heavy to be on Earth because I've been out in outer space, right? So this is the experience that astronauts have. Well, the same sort of thing happens here, but with ketamine, but conceptually. you don't really appreciate how much of your life is deeply conceptual. Even many of the things that you think are scientific or physical facts actually turns out to be conceptual. And this gets wiped away, and it's quite astounding. Personally, I've meditated for years, but I've never been able to reach a meditative state that was this empty of thought and this sort of like mindless, you might say, like a true state of no mind. I've not been able to reach that just through my normal efforts. Part of that is because I'm very conceptual, I'm very intellectual. So for me, one of my personal like greatest strengths, but also weaknesses in life, is that I am very intellectual about my approach and my attitude towards life. There's pros and cons to that. So the biggest pro to that is that I can put out all this great, deep content that explains to you using symbolic reasoning how reality works. That's what all of my videos are about, right? And if you like my content, that's why you like it. That's sort of like my unique selling point to you. But the flip side of that is that then it becomes difficult, really difficult to shut off the mind, because the mind gets in this attitude of thinking and trying to understand everything all the time. So it's in a sense, it's antithetical to meditation, because in meditation, you just want a blank mind. But then there's also pros and cons to having a blank mind. So a lot of what the meditative people don't tell you, the Buddhists and so forth, they don't tell you what you're losing by being in a state of no mind. You are losing some things too. You're not just gaining freedom. But for now, let's just focus on what you're gaining. What you're gaining is this enormous sense of freedom. I felt like so relaxed, so at ease, and deeply happy. Like a profound sense of happiness. And it's not a happiness that's like an ecstatic pleasure or bliss or ecstasy, which of course you can experience on classic psychedelics. I've experienced that a lot. That's its own separate category of happiness. This happiness here, it's a much more even-keeled, just like mellow, very chill, just like, complete relief from the need to think about anything. You're not thinking about your future anymore. You're not thinking about work tomorrow. You're not thinking about the kids that you got to take care of. You're not thinking about all the shit in your life that's bothering you. All of that is wiped out. And what I imagine for many people, this will be the first time in their life that they have been truly happy. There's just like a pure, very innocent joy to just sitting and being comfortable without being bored, without being excited, without having any kind of feelings tugging you in one direction or another, even positive emotions. When you're excited about something, when you're horny, you might think like these are great, and of course they can be great, but they're not peaceful. Because even your positive emotions, a lot of times they're pulling you towards something. You have a desire or something like that is happening. They're not letting you really just be at peace and just be kind of still. And so ketamine does that for you. And then what you realize, what's so valuable about this, which takes it just beyond some sort of, temporary escape from the obligations of normal life. What's valuable about this actually, from a personal development point of view and from a spiritual point of view, is that it shows you, rather than just telling you, it shows you just how much suffering is caused by your conceptualizing mind and your worrying about the future. Most people, I think, have no idea, because even for me, this was a bit shocking of a revelation. Most people have no idea how much of their suffering is caused simply by their thinking about the future, constructing and projecting a future. In fact, it's even more extreme than I'm letting on here, because really what I realized in this state of no mind is that all of suffering is caused by that. All of it. And of course, you can hear advanced meditators and Buddhists tell you this kind of stuff, But it's one thing to hear it and to read it in a book. It's another thing to actually experience it. Because that is a holy shit moment where it's like, holy shit, I'm completely free of suffering. I'm in such a peaceful, deeply relaxed state. I want nothing. I need nothing. Nothing is pulling me in any direction. I have no goals, no plans. I don't care about anything. And I can't even I can't even be bothered to think about the future or the past. That's what ketamine does for you. And then you're just left in the present moment. And then, as they say, of course, is like, what problems exist in the present moment? Really none. And you just feel simply happy without being in a state of pleasure. You're just happy. You're content. You're satisfied. And you need nothing. You don't feel like anything is missing, because what you don't realize, most people don't realize, is that the reason you can't be satisfied sitting here right now doing nothing is because your mind is so used, as part of its survival strategy, your mind is so used to thinking about all the stuff you need to worry about and do in the future to acquire the things you think you need to be happy, whether it's money, shelter, sex, relationship stuff, answering your emails, maintaining your job, going to the gym, all that stuff. You don't realize how much effort it takes to maintain all that stuff. Most people don't realize that. And so it's quite profound to actually experience a state of completely no suffering, and also no boredom. At the same time, you might think, well, isn't that kind of boring? It's not boring. Because boredom is also something your conceptual mind is constructing. That too is gone. Resistance is gone. Any kind of lingering anxiety in you is gone. Fear is gone. You can't be bothered to fear anything. Again, most people don't realize how much residual low-grade anxiety and fear exists in your mind and in your body as a sort of a constant low-grade humming background noise throughout your whole day as you're going through your day. Even if nothing terrible is happening to you, even if you're having a good day, there's always that little bit of worry and anxiety, just as being part of a human living in life. You know there's dangers in the future that you got to avoid. You got chores to do, taxes to take care of, this obligation, that obligation, your schedule is full, you got to go somewhere, be this place, answer that person. So all of that is wiped away. And it's very relieving. Furthermore, what I would say is that there was a lifting for me of depression and, well, I already mentioned anxiety, but yeah, a lifting of depression and anxiety. And it's not that I have depression. I've never really been a depressive person. I've struggled with depression a little bit more in the last couple of years because of some of the health issues that I've been dealing with, just because they were so stubborn that, you know, after a certain while of dealing with a health issue, you can't fix it, you get depressed over it. But that's a minor thing. Anyways, I'm not really a depressive person, but again, most of us don't realize that there's a little bit of sort of a background hum of depression, like almost like a little fog that you're living in day to day throughout your life. You don't even realize it. So ketamine lifts that away. And it does the same thing with anxiety. Now, I even noticed that, like, I don't consider myself as having depression, but I sort of noticed a little bit of that depression kind of just like lifted. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Where'd that do? I didn't even realize I had that depression. Like, it just kind of like lifted and went away because it's there all the time, so you don't notice it. Same with the anxiety. So based off that, I can see how powerful this tool of ketamine can be for people who really suffer from depression or anxiety, like high levels of it. I've never been a super anxious or depressive person, but some people are, some of you guys are, and I can see how this can be very powerful for that. What it does, it will show you that your depression and your anxiety is stemming from your future projecting and your conceptualizing mind. So basically, it's how your psyche is surviving in the world conceptually that is causing your depression and your anxiety. A lot of times people think that, oh, well, I'm depressed because like life is meaningless, and I'm depressed because I'm a nihilist or something like that. Go see my episode about nihilism, where I counter many of the common misconceptions about nihilism. But actually, that's not why you're depressed. You're not depressed or anxious because of some nihilism. You're depressed because your mind is constructing negative meaning. But you're not aware of that. Or even if you are aware of that, you're not capable of stopping it. You don't know how to stop it because your mind is just in this depressive habit that it's built up over years and decades. And it's the way you're thinking about your life, the meanings you're attaching to different aspects of your life, whether it's your relationships or your inability to get laid, or your frustration with your health problems, or your problems at your job, and whatever is causing your depression, maybe some family situation that's causing you depression or anxiety. That's all conceptual. All those problems, believe it or not, are conceptual, and ketamine just wipes those away. So I can see how this is a double-edged sword here. You have to be careful. Because if you do suffer from depression and anxiety, you might be tempted to say, like, well, Leo, then this is the cure. This is the magic pill to lift my depression, my anxiety. Yes, in a certain sense. The problem is that it only is going to last for an hour and a half. And then you're going to come back to your old conceptualizing mind, which is going to recreate your depression. See? So then you might say, well, Leo, then there's no value to it whatsoever. No, that's wrong. There is value to it because it shows you through direct experience that it is your mind constructing your depression or your anxiety. And it might give you insights into how you need to change how your mind works to stop doing that. The other double edge here, sort of the danger with this, is that even if it can show you all these good things and it can lift your depression for a while, of course, if you're very depressive and very anxious, this is going to feel like such a huge relief to you that you're very likely going to become addicted to this substance, and you're going to start using it chronically to escape from dealing with the problems in your life, and furthermore, from handling and changing the way that your mind works to create the depression, right? See, the real work here would be to take the ketamine, experience the relief, enjoy that, but really use that moment to see how your mind constructs depression or anxiety. And then when you come back, make a resolution to say, okay, what that showed me is that I can live without depression and anxiety, but I need to change how my mind works. I need to reconstruct my whole psyche so it stops creating depression and anxiety. And then you got to go through the, maybe a multi-year-long process to do that. I'm not fully sure what that would involve doing, but you'd have to change how you think, how you conceptualize things, and so forth. That would be difficult work. Most people who are very depressed or anxious, they would not want to do that difficult work. Instead, they would fall into the trap of saying, that lifted my depression. It feels like a cure-all. Let me just do more ketamine. And they just do dose after dose after dose of ketamine to the point where they're taking like 5 grams of ketamine per day, and then this destroys their bladder, their kidneys, gets them addicted, and it doesn't really solve anything for them, because eventually they're going to have to, you're going to run out of ketamine at some point. You can't be on ketamine your whole life. And also, when you're on this ketamine, you're not very functional. You can't also be a highly functional person when you're on a moderate to high dose of ketamine, because you can barely walk. So I can see a very powerful potential here for this substance to alleviate severe depression and to help people with anxiety and other things like that. But there's also a danger here if you misuse it. So basically, it puts you into a state of no mind, and it puts you into a state where nothing matters in a good way. This would be like true nihilism. It shows you really the difference between a sort of a conceptual nihilism and true nihilism. Conceptual nihilism is when your mind is telling you that nothing matters and life sucks, and then you become cynical and this whatever, right? This is bullshit. This isn't real nihilism. Real nihilism would be where like you truly don't give a shit about anything, and you're just happy as fuck as a result, because nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing means anything. There's nothing to do. There's no point. There's no goal. But there's also no boredom. There's no negative meanings attached to the meaninglessness. It's just perfectly meaningless, and it's awesome. You're basically just like sitting like a cat on a windowsill, enjoying whatever experience is before it. Just being. And it feels amazing. But it goes deeper than this. For me, what happened after this is that I started to kind of introspect and go inside myself and do a little spiritual work, the way that I like to do on psychedelics. And very quickly, I got a strong sense of like questioning my own identity, very deep sense of ego dissolution and no self. It produces what I would call the sort of classic no self awakening that many Buddhists talk about and many Advaitins talk about. So you can definitely get that with ketamine, especially at the higher doses, you'll get it. That was very easy for me to see. It was easy for me to introspect and to realize just how constructed my entire human identity is. Of course, I've experienced this many times on other psychedelics, so this is nothing new for me. But still, I would say that on other psychedelics, you can have a sort of a no-self awakening, but then usually it'll also be mixed together with a lot of like mystical visions and visionary stuff and sort of like more of the sort of like flavors of God and that kind of stuff. Whereas here, you don't get much of that. It's more bland. It's just sort of a more bland no-self, which is like a no-self awakening, which is sort of like what the Buddhists usually talk about and hold as like the pinnacle of spiritual work. Is just like wipe out the self to the point where it almost feels like you're just depersonalized. Like nothing is personal. You can't be bothered to take anything personal anymore. You can't even be bothered to be afraid or to be angry or to be jealous or to be frustrated. Like it's like you're sitting there and under this ketamine state, you're like, why would I even bother with feeling that way? Why would I have these thoughts about worrying about the future or the past? It also suppresses your memory to the point where if you have problems, if you have trauma in the past, it'll probably suppress that, I would imagine, because it becomes more difficult to access your memories because a lot of those are symbolic and also highly conceptual. And yeah, so you look inside yourself, you realize there's no self there. You realize that your whole human identity is just a construction, symbolic construction. And since symbolic reasoning is not even coming up for you, you're not even like thinking of yourself as a personal biographical self anymore. You're just sitting there as a conscious being. But then it kind of went one step deeper than that for me, is then I kept contemplating and introspecting more. And then I hit upon this very profound sense of not knowing. If you've been following my work, I'm a fan of Peter Ralston's work. He was a big influence on me, especially earlier in my spiritual journey. And his book, The Book of Not Knowing, I'm a big fan of that book. If you've read that book, if you like that book and some of his work, you can see that like what he's talking about with not knowing. If you struggle to understand what is not knowing and what is its significance, ketamine will show you. Ketamine will basically show you that you don't know anything. It shows you that all you're knowing is conceptual and symbolic, and that when that is wiped out, you literally just don't know. And I went further than that. I introspected. I was able to get in touch with infinity, with my infinite consciousness while I was on this ketamine. And then I introspected so deeply into the infinity that I like, and this is it's not like I hadn't realized this in the past, but it was just so prominent and so poignant on ketamine. Like I had the most profound sense of not knowing that I've ever had. I don't get not knowing so much on other psychedelics. I'll compare and contrast in a second with stuff like 5-MeO and DMT. But before we get to that, just the not knowing, like I really looked at what is the nature of knowing anything. And I looked at the infinite consciousness that I am. And then I realized that me as infinity is completely unknowable. It's literally absolutely impossible to know infinity. It's so hard to explain because it seems like sort of like a cop-out, or almost like this might make you cynical or nihilistic. But actually, there's a sort of a meta-knowing. You know that you as infinity are not knowable, and that any attempt to try to know or to explicate infinity is just absurd and futile. And this is not a problem for you like it is for the conceptual mind. This can be a problem. For the ego, this can be a problem. But when you're in this ketamine state, there is no conceptual mind, there is no ego at this point. And so it becomes this deeply profound mystical sense of not knowing, and you realize the absurdity of trying to know things. You realize how shallow and trivial and delusional that is. And so you appreciate the power of not knowing. And you surrender even the desire to know. And you don't really appreciate how much your mind has the desire to know and to make sense of reality. So this whole sense-making apparatus that the ego mind is, and that it's doing that function all the time. Most people aren't even aware that it's doing this, that your mind is doing this, trying to make sense of everything all the time. Your mind is doing this even if you're not some deep intellectual. Your mind is still doing this. Well, that's wiped out. And not only is it wiped out, but you see the absurdity of that. You see the futility of that. And then you resign to it. You surrender to the not knowing. You don't treat it as a bug. You treat it as a feature. And then from that, you get a profound sense of peace and joy. And personally, for me, this was very valuable because, look, my mind loves to understand things. That's like what my whole reason for living is, you might say, is the understanding of reality. And that's important. I'm not dismissing the importance of understanding. I'll talk more about that in the future and even in this episode. But it's such a huge relief, especially for me who spent his whole life trying to understand everything, to just realize that all of that, it has its use, but there's something like even deeper than that, which is the not knowing. Now, it's still, what's funny is that the not knowing still involves an understanding. You're understanding that you cannot be known, that infinity cannot be known. So that's still a form of understanding. But you realize that all the relative notions of knowing, that those are never going to get you to the truest knowing. The truest knowing is the not knowing, the knowing that infinity cannot be known. And that's an enormous relief. And I think this would be a huge relief, especially for intellectuals. If you're an intellectual type, if you're an overthinker, overanalyzer, if you're hyper left-brained, if you're very logical, if you're very scientifically minded, I don't know why, but right now, as I say that, a picture in my mind is coming up of Kurt Jaimungal. I did an interview with him. He's just like very sciencey oriented, very logical, sort of very rational, very meticulous. He asks very meticulous scientific questions about spiritual topics and other sorts of topics. Yeah, I mean, it's great. He's got a beautiful mind in a certain sense, but also like you can see just how much mind is going on there. And then like for him to do some ketamine, I would imagine and to experience this freedom from mind, and then looking back at his usual way of interfacing with reality, just like completely full of intellect, removing all that and seeing that difference, that contrast, that would be hugely valuable to him, I think. Because otherwise you're stuck in your mind and you don't even know you're stuck in your mind, and you're trying to use your mind to get yourself unstuck from your mind, but that gets you just more stuck in your mind, right? This is the biggest problem with intellectuals, is they actually think that more intellectualizing will solve their problem, and it doesn't. And most of them are blind to it. This is their biggest blind spot. with academic types, with professor types, with public intellectuals, people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, like these sorts of people. The Richard Dawkins types of people. A good dose of ketamine will humble them, and will rob them of the illusion of knowing. Because see, with people like that, and I include myself in that group of people, with people like us who are highly intellectual, like a lot of our ego is related to building up some sort of model of reality where like we really think we understand something through our conceptualizing. And we do a lot of analysis, and we do a lot of like technical intellectual work, and we really think we're getting somewhere. And then we take pride in our ability to think carefully and all this. And look, that's good at a certain level, but there's a level that's, you might say, deeper than that or above, transcendent of that, which is there's deeper aspects of reality that you just cannot access. And that, in fact, that whole scheme of intellectualizing, analyzing, modeling, mapping, making sense of things, that whole scheme is precisely the obstacle to realizing some of the deeper aspects of reality. And so I think ketamine can help very much with people like that who are stuck in their minds. Furthermore, what I got a little bit of a taste of God, of myself as God. I think that might be, though, because I have that now almost anytime I want to. Anytime I introspect, I can sense myself as God. So that I think just came from, hundreds of mystical awakenings that I've had on more classic psychedelics over the years. So to me, I'm very comfortable with that. That's very easy for me to access. But it's nothing extraordinary. It's nothing like as profound as you would get on 5-MeO-DMT or 5-MeO malt or even mushrooms or LSD. So ketamine, I think it could put you in touch with God or yourself as God. But I think most people wouldn't get that on ketamine. They would overlook it. It would be too subtle, too mild for them, and ketamine would not be as effective for a God realization as something like 5-MeO or DMT or even mushrooms. So there's that. I had insight while I was introspecting here. I had insight into how mind and self creates meaning, knowing, and suffering. I actually was able to see how my mind was creating it. And that was extremely valuable. It's very valuable to see that because usually in your normal state of consciousness, you can't see that. And on psychedelics, you can see some of that, but I would say psychedelics take you in a slightly different direction. There is something unique, some unique insights and realizations I got from ketamine that I did not get from over 150 trips on classic psychedelics, many of which were amazing and way more profound than this ketamine trip. So it's not that this ketamine trip was like my deepest trip or my highest awakening or anything like that. It wasn't. I've had much higher awakenings and God realizations and mystical experiences through other chemicals. But ketamine had a unique enough flavor profile that it highlighted certain flavors of consciousness and awakening and this whole spiritual work and how my psyche worked. It hits on certain notes that classic psychedelics don't hit on at all or hit on indirectly. And I'm not saying here that you couldn't realize many of these things that I'm talking about on some other chemical or some classic psychedelic. You probably could realize any of these things on almost any psychedelic. The issue is sort of like certain chemicals just like hit you with certain facets of awakening and spirituality in more prominent ways. In the same way that, your tongue, you can put different foods on it and that food will, even though most food consists of sweet, sour, salty, umami flavors. There's only like 5 different basic flavors, spicy. There's only like 5 basic flavors, but each food hits your tongue receptors in a different way and highlights different aspects of the sweetness, the saltiness, and the different combinations thereof, right? There's a lot of variation in food, even though there's like only a few basic type of taste receptors. So I find it's the same way like with the mind or with the brain and these chemicals. There's not that many different facets of awakening and spirituality and how your mind works, but at the same time, there's multiple dozens of them, and you can hit them from different angles, and you can explore them, and you can go into them at different lengths. You know, there's different degrees of sourness, for example. You know, something can be a little bit sour or like ridiculously sour, and you don't really appreciate what sourness is until you feel and explore all the different variations of sourness and even how it combines and connects with sweetness and saltiness and all this. So that's kind of what's happening here. So I think there's something valuable about this ketamine experience, even though I've basically touched upon all these different facets in previous work that I've done through tripping and meditation and so forth. I would say that ketamine gives you a sense of what depersonalization disorder and derealization disorder might be like. It does feel that way. A lot of times people complain when they have a depersonalization or derealization disorder, they actually complain that they're suffering. So in that sense, ketamine isn't like that because there's no suffering. In fact, it's the opposite of that. So maybe it's not fully the same as depersonalization, derealization. Maybe it is more just like sort of a classic Buddhist awakening. It's simple, it's stark, it's Zen-like. It's not very mystical or imaginative. And then after a few hours, it basically goes away. But I was left with a pleasant afterglow, that lifting of depression and low-grade anxiety and just kind of like a joy and sort of freedom from your own mental bullshit and monkey chatter. That was like an afterglow that stayed with me for a couple of days. And then, of course, what happens is that because you're back in normal life, your normal mind comes back, your symbolic reasoning all comes back online after your trip. And then, of course, you're in the middle of life and you're faced with emails you got to answer, taxes you got to do, chores you got to do, business problems, relationship problems, family problems, career problems, money problems, sexual problems, right? All this, it all comes flooding back. And then your mind just goes back into survival mode and it's thinking about how to handle all this stuff. It's like you're juggling balls, you know, juggling 10 different balls, surviving. And then very quickly you fall right back into your old habits. And if you're not careful, you're just going to fall right back into them and you're going to recreate your depression, you're going to recreate your anxiety by how your mind is attaching and projecting meaning onto everything in the world because that's part of your survival process. And so what was very valuable to me about ketamine is it showed me just like the connection between how my mind is thinking about certain things in the future, the meaning it's attaching to that, and then how that's coming back to bite me in the ass with some low-grade form of suffering, anxiety, fear, sadness, disappointment, frustration, and then how that cycle is perpetuating itself. And furthermore, where that all came from, it's like, oh, I can go back into my childhood and I can see that, oh, this is just like a survival strategy that I learned back when I was at school. You know, I learned to handle life this way and to think this way about this thing. And then if this happens, then I look at that negatively. And if that happens, I look at it positively. And then like you learn how to basically psychically survive. You learn how to survive as a mind when you're a kid, and then those habits just get ingrained over decades, and then you're just executing them spontaneously without even thinking about them. And so the real work in personal development and spiritual growth is to see that and then change those habits, which of course is a much bigger thing, and ketamine will not simply change all that for you. It's not going to fix everything for you. It's not some magic pill. But the thing is that most people have no idea that this is even happening. They don't even know that where their suffering is coming from. They don't see, and they won't even believe you when you tell them that your suffering is created by your own mind. They don't believe it. They really think their suffering is coming from some external problem in the world. Like, Leo, I'm suffering because my dad is an asshole, or I'm suffering because my girlfriend's a bitch, or I'm suffering because she cheated on me, or I'm suffering because I don't have enough money. That's not why you're suffering. You're suffering because of how your mind is attaching meaning to those things and constantly thinking about those things, ruminating negatively about those things, and you're not conscious of that whole process, and you don't know how to stop. You don't know how to stop it, and this is how you're surviving. Literally, your physical survival depends upon the meanings you're attaching and the sort of augmented reality that your psyche has created to survive as that particular psyche that you identify as. That's the true cause of your suffering. So if you're one of these people who is into spiritual work because you really want to escape suffering, and hey, a lot of Buddhists frame spirituality in this way. Buddha himself probably did, I think, is, the point of spirituality is to escape suffering. Well, if that is truly why you want to pursue spirituality and you're pursuing my work and awakening in God because you think it's going to free you from suffering, and that's what you care about most because you're in such a deep state of suffering, this is for you. And I don't just mean that you should do a bunch of ketamine. What I mean is that maybe do a little ketamine and then notice the actual structure that is creating your suffering, become conscious of that, and then go about the difficult work of correcting those habits. And that's how you can escape your suffering. So the value of ketamine in this process would be to kind of be the gateway to show you, rather than just me telling you or some guru or some Buddhist telling you. It's very different for some Buddhist monk to tell you something versus you actually experiencing the very mechanism by which your mind creates suffering. Because if you're not conscious of it, you're going to be at its effect. You can't transcend it. And so, yeah, there's going to be some kind of afterglow, but then the afterglow will wear off, so be ready for that. Don't think that the afterglow will stick around forever. So now let's compare a little bit ketamine versus something like 5-MeO-DMT. Because you're probably wondering, well, Leo, I like what I'm hearing here about ketamine, so should I do ketamine instead of 5-MeO-DMT? What's your favorite now? Do you like ketamine more than 5-MeO-DMT? What about DMT? What about mushrooms? What about 5-MeO-malt? What about other stuff you've talked about? Leo, what's better for our work here? If I'm trying to actualize all this Actualized.org stuff, what's the best chemical to help me? I would still say that if you really want the deepest understanding of reality possible, what you're actually searching for is you're not searching for a Buddhist style no self awakening. I mean, that's good. You want that. But what you're really after is you're after omniscience. And ketamine doesn't give you that omniscience. And what you're really after with omniscience is you're after God. You're after God realization. God realization is still the highest, even though this not knowing stuff is great. The no self stuff is great. Freedom from suffering is great. All that is great. No mind, that's great. But it's just, it pales in comparison to realizing yourself as God and a state of complete omniscience and love. Oh, I forgot to talk about love. Let's bring that up since we're on this topic. Let's mention that. Well, I mean, the reason I forgot to talk about it is because there really was none. You don't really get it. I didn't get any profound sense of love on this ketamine trip. And I doubt I would get much more of it if I did higher doses, because I didn't really get any flavors of love, no real realizations of love. And so ketamine would not be good for realizing love. That doesn't mean love is any less real. It just means that ketamine doesn't focus on that facet of awakening or consciousness. At least not in my experience. So, so if you want the highest awakening, you got to realize fucking love is what I'm telling you. So for that purpose, 5-MeO-DMT is still one of the best. 5-MeO-malt is still one of the best. I would say those are the two best. DMT, classic DMT and NDMT, also up there, probably in the top 3. Of course, LSD, mushrooms, those are all good. but at a lower tier. Really, your top three are 5-MeO-DMT, 5-MeO-malt, and classic DMT. I would put those at the very top. And so if you're looking for God realization, then those three. If you're looking for love realization, then one of those three. And I would still prefer to do those over ketamine. But I still think there's value in ketamine. I think there's value in doing it more than once. I think there's value in doing it at higher doses carefully, right? Because it does inhibit your ability to walk and to see. So you got to be careful. There's danger potential there. But it's worth exploring. I think 5 trips of ketamine in your lifetime, at least, would be good to explore that. And then, I don't know, maybe if you're finding value in it, keep doing it beyond that. But I probably wouldn't do it more than like 5 or 10 times, because I would just find more value in the other chemicals. For what I'm interested in, which is the highest understanding of reality, ketamine is not going to cut it. And in fact, it might create a false sense that you're done, so to speak, and that you've sort of realized the classic Buddhist awakening sort of thing, and that you're sort of done, and that now there's nothing to know, and that's it, you're done. And the reality is that that's an illusion. You're fooling yourself. And really what's very fascinating about comparing something like 5-MeO-malt with ketamine is that it just shows you the limitations of narrow paths like Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta or Neo-Advaita stuff, or the sort of like very simplistic no-self teachings. These sort of very stripped down reductionistic versions of spirituality. These forms of spirituality where you're aiming towards cessation or the quieting of the mind. You're aiming towards no mind, and that this is the sort of the ultimate realization. These are not the ultimate realization. They're great, but they're not the ultimate. And I think it's very difficult to see that without any chemicals, because if you're just going to be following a Buddhist path just to reach that level of no mind and like liberation or whatever else you want to call it, Buddhists have all sorts of words for it, to reach these kinds of states of consciousness requires so much work. It's so rare that when you do achieve it, you're going to think you've arrived. And you're not going to know what you're missing. And really, that's because you don't realize the infinite number of states that consciousness can take, and you have no idea the highest states that consciousness can take. And again, like I've said in the past, meditation is not going to take you to the highest states of awakening. It just isn't. And the reason I say that is not to be arrogant, but because I've interacted with a lot of people in the spiritual community who have done Buddhist practice and various kinds of Neo-Advaita practices and Advaita Vedanta practices and so forth. And it's just obvious to me that they haven't had the most profound kind of awakenings that I've experienced on, for example, 5-MeO-malt or 5-MeO-DMT. That's a whole other order of magnitude of thing. And to me, it's a higher awakening. And it takes you more actually in the sort of religious direction and more into the Christian direction than it does into the Eastern Buddhist Vedantic direction, which are more stripped down forms of spirituality. The 5-MeO-malt and 5-MeO-DMT takes you more into what I would say is like the ecstatic forms of spirituality. It's an ecstatic mysticism. Whereas Buddhism is more just like ketamine that just sort of like nukes your conceptual mind. But nuking your conceptual mind is not the same thing as omniscience or infinite consciousness or God realization or the realization that reality is love. And that's why a lot of Buddhists will deny God or they will deny love. Not all of them, some of them admit it, but a lot of them I've talked to advanced Buddhists who clearly have no idea what God is. They clearly aren't conscious of themselves as God. And that's because all they've done in their 40 years of practice is they've just sat in meditation and they've trained themselves. What does meditation do? It just trains you to nuke your conceptual mind. And then you're sitting there in a state of no mind. And that's great. You're free of suffering. You're peaceful. Someone could even pour a can of gasoline on you and light it on fire, and maybe you're not going to make a peep because you've trained yourself so well, and your mind's not creating any suffering, and you could burn alive. And that looks cool, right? It looks very badass. And you might say you're liberated and all that. That's all fine. And there's maybe a utility for all that. But it isn't the same as God realization. You're not actually omniscient. So for me, I would take 5-MeO DMT or 5-MeO malt or DMT, classic DMT, over ketamine. And I think it's very useful to compare and contrast in your own direct experience. Look, if you're a serious meditator, if you're a serious Buddhist, a serious Advaitin, or Vedanta practitioner, or yogi, or whatever it is, I can't communicate enough to you how valuable it is for you to experience radically different states of consciousness that are very different from the tradition or the sort of lineage that you come from. If you're good at meditation, that's great, but I bet you're missing something. If you can enter effortlessly into a state of no mind and no suffering, that's great. You've achieved that, let's say, but I bet you're missing something. And you don't know what you're missing until the psychedelic shows you what you're missing. That's really one of the magic powers of psychedelics. It's not that they're going to completely transform your mind and make you liberated and free of all suffering forever. In that sense, psychedelics are pretty bad. If that's all you want, then psychedelics won't give that to you in many cases. But what psychedelics really are good at is just showing you the full gamut of what consciousness is capable of, and it shows you how radically different high states of consciousness can be. Not all high states of consciousness are the same. They can be radically different, and it shows you why there's so much diversity within spiritual traditions and mystical traditions. They're not all the same. The Christians, the Buddhists, the Vedantists, the yogis, they're not all talking about the same stuff. They're accessing different states of consciousness, high states of consciousness, mystical states of consciousness, godly states of consciousness, but in different ways and different flavors and at different degrees and depths. But none of them are accessing the full gamut. Therefore, there's so much disagreement, dispute, and hostility, and naysaying and criticism from one tradition to the next. There's also a lot of overlap, of course, as well. There's a lot of agreement, but there's a lot of disagreement too. And this explains why a lot of even awakened teachers will disagree with each other, criticize each other, fight with each other, and claim that one is not awakened when the other one is, and all that kind of stuff, right? It seems petty, but actually it's not petty. It's because the gamut of consciousness is much broader than anybody thinks, even awakened people. And you need to understand that awakening comes in many degrees and many flavors. This word awakening or enlightenment is a very dangerous word in the sense that you hear it, then you just start to assume that, well, everyone who's talking about awakening or enlightenment are talking about the same thing, the same experience, the same depth, the same breadth, all the same facets. And the answer is no, that's not the case. People are using this word awakening or enlightenment or whatever, they're using it in their own personal way, referring to their own personal experiences, which are different from other awakened people's experiences. And it's very hard to then compare those experiences the only way to do it is personally for yourself. The only way you can compare different kinds of awakenings, different depths and degrees and flavors of awakenings, different facets of awakenings, is by going through it yourself. And that's very difficult to do through any kind of singular spiritual practice. But it's very easy to do with a variety of different types of chemicals. It's like a consciousness buffet. That's the difference. A traditional spiritual path is like going to your same favorite restaurant over and over and over and over again, and really eating the same meal over and over again and getting really familiar with that meal, and maybe even very satisfied with it over time. To the point where you forget that there's more than just that one meal. That's possible in the culinary world. And then what I'm advocating is more of a buffet approach, right? You go to a Las Vegas buffet, the Caesars buffet, one of the best buffets in Vegas that I've been to. You go there, and then you get to sample 100 different things. And some of them are not so great, others of them are amazing, but there's a sort of a meta quality to it that's above and beyond any individual dishes that you get to experience and compare and contrast all of them, and you see that, oh my God, that's really the magic of consciousness and God and mind, is not that it does one thing deeply, but that it has this incredible diversity to it. And then you can make sense of mystical traditions and spiritual traditions and different religions a lot better. And you can make sense of spiritual disputes a lot better, because you realize that really a lot of what spiritual disputes are about is like, one person at a buffet arguing for their favorite dish, another person arguing for their favorite dish because all they've eaten is just that one dish. They didn't go around the whole buffet and try all the different dishes to see the infinite diversity of the dishes and the various kinds of pros and cons to those dishes. So the reason I'm so passionate about psychedelics, people keep saying, Leo, when are you going to hear the message and hang up the phone? It's like, I like exploring consciousness. What else is there to do but to explore consciousness? To me, that's the point of life, is to explore consciousness. So I've never found this sort of like singular monomaniacal Buddhist tradition or Advaitin tradition or yoga tradition to be appealing to me, because it always felt just intuitively too limiting. Why would I straitjacket myself by sticking to one tradition? Of course, there's pros and cons to this. When you stick to one tradition, you can go like really hard on it and get really good at meditating. So I do sacrifice in that sense. I'm not the best meditator. But I think what I sacrificed there, I've more than made up for in other ways by exposing myself to this vast gamut, this diversity of high states of consciousness and awakenings and facets of awakenings that just simply I would not have been able to explore and wouldn't even know about if I just blindly stuck to some dogmatic, Buddhist meditative practice for decades, the way that some hardcore Buddhists do. And look, I appreciate their dedication. That's not easy to do. Honestly, I envy that kind of, monomaniacal focus that some Buddhist practitioners have. I don't have that. To me, I love exploring the diversity of consciousness too much to sit there for years and decades doing the same old breath counting technique. To me, that's way too limiting of a form of spirituality. I need a much more broader, richer form of spirituality than that. So that's what I'm pursuing, and I love the fact that consciousness has so much diversity to it to explore, and I'm excited to explore that further. Because the amazing thing is that you never know what you're going to find around the corner. You think you've got all the facets, but then you realize there was something hidden in some nook around the corner that you didn't quite know about. And maybe some chemical unlocks that for you. So that to me is the true value and power of psychedelics. So, what's the final verdict on ketamine? Is it worth doing? Here is my thoughts in a nutshell. Here's a summary. Ketamine is good for depression and anxiety, at least temporarily. I wouldn't expect it to be a magic pill to solve it forever. And don't think you can just keep doing ketamine every day and you're going to be well off. I don't think that's going to work. But it is good for a temporary relief. I think if you're having suicidal thoughts, it can be very helpful against that too. I think, like, for example, if you're on the edge of killing yourself and you have no other saving grace, you've tried everything else and nothing works. At that point, I think, yeah, you have nothing to lose. Give ketamine a shot. It'll definitely wipe out your suicidal thoughts, at least for a few hours, maybe for a few days. Hey, that's better. That might hold you over if you're in a really bad funk, suicidally speaking. Ketamine is great for shutting off the mind, for accessing non-symbolic consciousness, if you don't know what that is, for analysis suppression. If you suffer from analysis paralysis, then just overthinking everything or anxiety caused by that, then ketamine will be good for that. Again, at least temporarily. Ketamine is good for showing you how you're constructing that, your depression, your anxiety, through your thoughts. It's good for that. It's good for accessing not knowing, deep states of not knowing. If you don't understand what not knowing is, or you haven't had a profound awakening into not knowing, you need that. I think that's very important. And that might be difficult to access on certain other psychedelics. Realizing no self, that's also important. Of course, it's important to realize that your biographical, human, conceptual self is a fabrication. Ketamine could be good for that. The downside of ketamine is going to be that it's going to distort your visual field in an uncomfortable way. And the higher the dose, the worse it's going to get. With blurring vision, doubled vision, wandering vision, it's going to be hard to even focus on things and see things clearly. There's going to be difficulty walking. That can become dangerous. The other downside is that there's going to be a higher danger at higher doses. It's not really a fun psychedelic. You're not going to be very sociable on it. It's not good for recreation. I would have a lot more fun personally on 5-MeO-DMT or 5-MeO malt or almost any other psychedelic I would probably have more fun on, except salvia. Salvia is not fun for me. Ketamine, the other downside of ketamine, it's not as mystical as classic psychedelics. It's not as profound as 5-MeO-DMT, malt, or DMT. So if you're really looking for like deep, mystical, spiritual profundity and insight, ketamine is not the best for that. It's not as godly or loving. So if you're looking for a God realization or a love realization, love awakening, God awakening, probably try something other than ketamine. It is potentially physically harmful. There's reports that with a lot of use, and it has to be quite a lot of use, you will start to experience bladder problems and kidney problems. Pretty severe ones. But this is usually with people who've used it, who consume like multiple grams of ketamine per day, which is an enormous amount. These are people who are basically addicts. Speaking of which, there's potential here for addiction. I can especially see it with people who are very depressed, very anxious, or very suicidal. Once they get a little taste of ketamine and they see how good it is, because it's going to give them such a huge sense of relief from all that shit, that you're just going to want to do it the whole day, every week. And if you get into that territory, now you're using it to escape your problems. You're not actually solving any of your problems. You're fooling yourself. And on top of that, you're actually physically harming your bladder and your kidneys and probably other parts of your body, maybe even your brain with that much use. And also what's going to happen is you're going to build up tolerance. That's the last negative thing I have to say about ketamine is that it has tolerance. So it takes about 7 days for the tolerance to go away, 7 to 10 days to completely remove the tolerance. But if you get addicted to it and you keep using it all the time, you can develop tolerance that's going to eventually turn into tolerance that lasts for weeks and even for months if you way overuse it. So the nice thing about the more classic psychedelics, especially 5-MeO-DMT, 5-MeO malt, and DMT, is that they have no tolerance whatsoever. Now, mushrooms and LSD, those do have tolerance, which is about also 7 to 10 days. But the classic psychedelics, relatively speaking, compared to ketamine, they don't actually cause physical harm to the brain or your kidney or your bladder or any of your organ systems, as far as I understand and in my experience. So I definitely think that something like 5-MeO-DMT is physically safer. It's also not addictive. So there's less potential for abuse there. Now, I have to mention that I've only done a moderate dose of ketamine. I haven't done high doses or doses high enough to reach what they call the K-hole. And so some of you who have reached the K-hole might be saying, Leo, what are you talking about? Ketamine is so profound and so mystical and all this. Like, you're underselling ketamine because you just haven't gone deep enough. I'm fully aware of that possibility. I'm extra careful with ketamine because I am worried about how it might affect my health and so forth. And, some of the dangers with losing sight of your vision and losing your walking ability. There's definitely dangers to ketamine beyond stuff that you can experience on 5-MeO-DMT or other psychedelics. So I'm cautious about that. I don't know, maybe at some point in my life I will take enough ketamine to experience a K-hole. I've read reports about it. It sounds pretty profound. I would like to experience it maybe at one point in my life. But I'm not really rushing to get there. And I don't know. I still think you're going to get ultimately a deeper awakening through something like 5-MeO-DMT. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the K-hole will change my mind about it. I don't know. So just keep that in mind. This is sort of like giving you the moderate dosed version of what ketamine is. If you take it at really high doses, it might get much more profound than what I've talked about here. But also keep in mind that if you take crazy high doses of 5-MeO-DMT or 5-MeO-malt or DMT, you will also reach states that are just absurdly profound beyond anything that words can describe. So again, you have to kind of compare apples to apples here. Because if you compare a mild dose of 5-MeO-DMT with a K-hole dose of ketamine, then yeah, the ketamine might be more profound, but you got to also then take like the K-hole version dose of 5-MeO-DMT to compare it to the K-hole dose of ketamine, and then who knows who knows which one is going to be more profound. And then also we have to be open to the possibility that for different people, different substances will have different degrees of profundity. Kind of depends on what your priorities are, what your interests are, and even your genetics and how the chemical affects your brain, because these chemicals affect people in different ways. And you're really not going to know until you try it for yourself. So with that said, ultimately the question is, should you do ketamine? Do I recommend it? Here's my thoughts on that. First of all, if you're not mentally stable and you suffer from mental illness, then I don't recommend any kind of chemical for you. No tripping for you, basically. It's too risky. But assuming that's not the issue, I think, like I said, it's worth doing at least a few times if you're serious about understanding consciousness. My teachings are geared towards people that really want to understand consciousness. If you don't care about understanding consciousness and exploring the full gamut of consciousness, then don't do it. And maybe for you, your mushrooms and your LSD is enough. For me personally, it's worthwhile to experience the difference, to be able to contrast tryptamines versus dissociatives, because they are a different class of chemical. And if you only do psychedelics and tryptamines, and you miss out on the dissociatives, then you're going to be missing something potentially. So to me, that's a valuable contrast and experience to have. But overall, I still prefer tryptamines over dissociatives. And then the final point is the healing potential. There is some great healing potential with this chemical for depression, anxiety, trauma, suicidal thoughts. That's the plus side, but the minus side is that those people who suffer the most from those conditions are probably going to be the people that most likely abuse ketamine and get addicted to it and destroy their body with that addiction and use it as an escape rather than as a legitimate tool for personal development and growth. And so in that case, I don't know what to tell you people. Like, you know, if you're on the brink of suicidal depression, for example, should you take ketamine? I mean, on the one hand, you got little to lose if you're already thinking about killing yourself. On the other hand, maybe it just sends you over the top and makes you even more suicidal after you come back down from it, you know, because when you're going to be in it, you're going to feel great. But when you come out of it, you're going to feel so shitty again. And if you're not going to take responsibility for actually changing your life and the way your mind works, you're just going to go back into your old thoughts. And that's probably going to even make you even more depressed and more hopeless and even more suicidal. And maybe then you get addicted to ketamine. And I don't know, is it better for you to have suicidal thoughts and potentially kill yourself? Or is it better for you to get addicted to ketamine for the next 5 years and destroy your bladder and your kidneys, but at least you don't kill yourself, you know, with a gun? Which is better? I don't know. There's no way I can answer that for you. You know, you got to figure that out for yourself. I'm just sharing some of my thoughts and experiences with you. Ultimately, it's very important for me that you take full responsibility for whatever you put into your body, how you change your consciousness, how you explore consciousness, how you do personal development work, how you do spiritual work, right? I'm not telling you to do any particular thing. I'm sharing my experiences. I'm giving you ideas of what's possible. You have to then do your own research and critically decide for yourself as the CEO of your life, the chief executive of your life. That's you. As the CEO of your life, you bear full responsibility for what you decide to do with your life, which meditation techniques you decide to do, which yoga techniques, which books you read, which teachers you listen to, whether you even listen to what I'm saying and you believe me or disbelieve me, you're responsible for that in the end. Don't try to offload that responsibility onto me. I try to make these videos as safe as possible, but in the wrong hands, this information is not safe. Nothing is safe in the wrong hands. A fork is not safe in the wrong hands. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about all this stuff. Don't try to do things because you think I told you to do them. I didn't tell you to do anything. I want you to be mature enough and take ownership over your life that when you decide to do something, it's because you decided to do it, because you think it's right for you based on your best intuitions and research, rather than because some authority figure or some charismatic YouTuber persuaded you with some fancy words to do something. Don't do things just because you see me doing them. Do things because it makes sense for you in your overarching plan for your life that you yourself have designed carefully, consciously, by sitting down and reflecting, independent of whatever anybody else thinks or says, including myself. Based on your highest values and your life purpose and your priorities. This is crucial. You can't have a good life without taking on this responsibility. It's a big responsibility to take ownership of your own life and to make decisions for yourself and to generate your own answers rather than looking for other authority figures to just give you the answers, the easy answers, without working for them. Generating your own answers takes more work. That's why people don't do it, because they're lazy and they want just somebody to give them a quick answer. Somebody smart, somebody charismatic, somebody that they can hold up, put on a pedestal as some authority figure, guru, spiritual teacher, or whatever. So hopefully you understand that. And I think most of you do. And as long as you do that, that's what should keep you more or less safe, at least as safe as you can be. Now, there's no guarantees of safety in life, You just want to take precautions. And one of the most important precautions is to think for yourself and not just to blindly follow the words of others or just do something that I'm doing just because I'm doing it. See, I'm me and you're you. I have a unique character profile. You have a unique character profile. Ketamine could affect me differently than the way it affects you. DMT can affect me differently than the way that it affects you. My goals could be different from your goals. My spiritual goals can be different from your spiritual goals, you see. So that's all something you have to think about. Sit and contemplate this stuff. Go for a drive. Go drive around town for an hour. Contemplate this stuff for yourself, rather than just clicking on the next video and just glutting your mind with more video, more video, more video, more video. I hope you're taking time to pause and reflect on these videos, especially my videos, because I pack a lot of material and insight into these videos. A lot of experience goes into these episodes such that you can watch one of them and contemplate it for weeks, for months, for years, and extract more insights from it, and also act on it and gain experiences and rewatch it. Like, you have to engage with this material. Don't just be passively listening to this stuff while you're cooking dinner every night and you just watch one video after another and not thinking about it, and you're just always constantly jumping from video to video to video, just listening and imbibing information, being programmed by my words while you're doing some mindless chore, but not sitting down and actually consciously thinking about these things that were said to you. That would be a big mistake, a big trap that I want you to avoid. All right. That's it for today. See you in the next one.